Hello everybody, welcome to a tarot tutorial. Today I'll be using this very old deck to explain to you what the various tarot cards mean. So let's get into it. This is the Marseille deck, and I think the artwork is very simple but classic. It makes a lot of use of primary colors. You can probably tell that it's falling apart. So it comes with this instruction booklet. With lots of information about each card, but I'm going to be doing that for you today. It is worth mentioning that tarot is very much about interpretation, so it's probably worth hearing what a few people have to say about the cards, because there are so many different ways in which they can be interpreted. So today I'll just be trying to show you everything that I know. Okay. So the deck is made up of the major arcana and the minor arcana. The major arcana are the tarot cards that you might be familiar with, like Wheel of Fortune and Death. The minor arcana are very similar to a regular deck of cards that everybody is familiar with. So I'll be starting with the minor arcana, but I'll put timestamps in the description for if you just want to see the major arcana. So in the minor arcana we have 4 suits, cups, pentacles, swords, and wands. Each one represents an element of living a human life. So, cups are emotional, pentacles are physical, tangible, material, swords are intellectual and to do with the mind, and wands are spiritual. The cards go from 1 or ace to 10, and then you have the page or the knave, the knight, the queen, and the king. Okay. So, numbers 1 to 10 are kind of cyclical. They move through a cycle. It might end on a high note, or it might end on a crisis or a seemingly bad note. things aren't always so bad. I'll explain that a little bit more. So let's start with the aces. This is the Ace of Cups. I'll just show you these in detail because they're so beautiful. This is the Ace of Swords. So if you'll remember, cups are emotional and swords are intellectual. This is the Ace of Wands, which is a spiritual card. And finally, Pentacles, which is material. So aces generally mean new beginnings. They're the beginning of a cycle. And so the Ace of Pentacles could mean the manifestation of something. The Ace of Swords could mean a mental clarity. And the Ace of Wands could signify some kind of inspiration that has struck. Odd numbers like 1, 3, 5 tend to signify change and instability, movement, while even numbers tend to signify stability. So the 2s mean that there is an element of balance and duality, as you can see it being so beautifully portrayed in this balance between the 2 coins. So in the material plane, this might mean a choice, a practical choice that needs to be made. Often, when pentacles are involved and the person has an action that needs to be made, a pentacle card can signify that they should use common sense, be practical rather than maybe listening to their gut or acting on emotion. So in this deck, this straight, well, I don't know what you would call this, but the straight ones are the wands, like here, and the curved ones are the swords. In a 2 of Cups, you might find elements of partnership, but a basic rule that you can follow is to know the basic meaning of the number and the basic thing to which the suit applies. So a 2 of Swords would mean a balancing of the mind, perhaps a challenge or perhaps the success thereof. 3 tends to signify working towards something, and in the Cups it also tends to signify friendship, which I suppose is a working of some kind. The Three of Pentacles also tends to mean collaboration, and that makes sense in a practical sense because that is often required when working towards anything. Four, you might recall, is a stable card because it's an even number, and specifically 4 is the most stable card. But this doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. It can also signify stagnation. So the 4 of Cups tends to signify a period of no movement really, but in which intense contemplation is happening. And 4 precedes 5, which is the most unstable time in the cycle. So this can signify a period of contemplation before a big change is made. This is the 4 of Wands, and in a spiritual sense, the 4 can be positive. It can mean a period of harmony with oneself. But in the case of Pentacles, for example, the stability in the 4 in the material realm can signify a kind of holding on and a possessiveness, which is perhaps not so positive. Next, we have 5. And as I said, 5 is a changing card. So, the 5 of Cups generally signifies that someone is not having such a good time. It means bereavement and difficulty in an emotional sense. The 5 of Wands can mean strife, struggle with the spirit as well. And generally 5 is a time of challenge. So in the material plane, it can mean general insecurity. Next, we have 6. So, in the cyclical movement of things, we've gone from a period of great change to a more stable period. And 6 signifies a period of relaxation, of adjustment, maybe. And so for Pentacles, the kind of ease that one finds in this stage can give rise to a generosity in the material plane, a kind of security and relaxation. And in Cups, it can signify nostalgia, a period of looking back, of deep thinking, a period of not much movement again. And swords tends to signify a period of transition. So next we have 7, and 7 is a period of discovery. So in an emotional sense, this might involve a lot of self-reflection, introspection, maybe even fantasizing as one discovers all of the deepest parts of one's emotional body. The wands tend to signify a perseverance. That's not wands. There we go. It tends to signify a perseverance, a time when everything moves to a point where it may be challenging, but if one is on a spiritual path of some kind, one is remaining true to it at this point and using this period of self-discovery to further that spiritual goal and fulfillment. In the case of Pentacles, it can mean that one is taking time to think on things and maybe even invest in something new, in a dream, in yourself. So reflection, self-discovery. And then we move on to 8. I love in this deck the 8 of Swords because it really shows how some decks more than others, but all of them really, you can sometimes just interpret a lot from the card itself without knowing any of its backstory. And I think incorporating this when you read a set of cards is really valuable because it adds an element of intuition to the reading, a unique and personalized element to the reading, which, when you think about it, is quite fateful. It's quite, I think it just enriches the reading when you make some intuitive judgments. This card very beautifully portrays its meaning, which can be interpreted as isolation, by this lonely blue flower in the center. I think it's a really powerful visual. But 8 generally means movement. So in Cups, it can mean escaping, fleeing, allowing oneself to be distracted as a movement perhaps away from. And in the swords and wands, at this point it begins to get a bit, one could view it as negative, because the swords, for example, are moving towards isolation, and the movement in the wands as well. I think you'll see in cards to come that the movement is towards burden, towards hardship. Not all the cycles end on a good note, but for the wands, for example, it's not necessarily bad that the cycle ends on a burden, because often when we are unburdened, we are very comfortable and we aren't encouraged or forced to make changes and to think deeply about things that may be festering under the surface. And so the cycle ends in difficulty, but gives rise to a new beginning once again and to change. Similarly, with swords, for the intellectual cycle to end on difficulty means that the coping mechanisms are finally exhausted, and things that we were coping with but wanted to change now need to be addressed, for example. So moving on to 9. In a suit like Pentacles, 9 means gratitude. Gratitude for all one's material blessings. And 9 generally refers to the completion of something, but 10 is also completion, but more so. 9 is completion with something still to come. So in Pentacles, it's gratitude. In Wands, however, it refers to resilience, a lost battle, a lost effort. In Swords, it refers to despair. And in Cups, it refers to satisfaction, which I have lost, apparently. Okay, well, that's fine. Next, 10. So, a 10 of Pentacles, which would mean wealth, a completion in a very real sense of this goal in this particular realm of life. So a 10 of Pentacles would mean wealth. There she is. A 10 of Swords, as we said, means a crisis that we can no longer cope with. And a 10 of Cups tends to mean happiness. While we mentioned that a 10 of Wands would mean burden. Okay, so now we have the Knave, Knight, Queen, and King. The King tends to represent full development of something. The Queen very aptly refers to a nurturing. The Knight is kind of an action card, and the Knave or the Page is more of an idea card. So let's see how that plays out. The Knave of Swords, for example. There he is. The Knave of Swords can signify energy, a new energy with which to act on an idea, while the Knave of Pentacles often refers to practicality, and so you can tell that it's learning, perhaps, and an idea, kind of like a resolution that one might make. It's got that similar kind of energy, this card, but in relation to whatever suit you're dealing with. So the Knights, the Knight of Cups, for example, an action card would refer to passion, while the Knight of Pentacles would refer to an efficiency in what you do on a practical level, an efficiency at getting it done. The Queens are nurturing cards, and so the Queen of Pentacles, for example, is a card that represents nurturing in the most practical sense. So maternity, caring for, taking care of. So the Queen of Cups is a nurturing of one's emotional skills, and so this can often refer to intuition, being able to tell things intuitively. And the Queen of Swords, on a level of the mind, can refer to the nurturing of one's perception of the world. And lastly, we have our 4 kings. So, let's see if he'll focus. Will he, won't he? The great question. Okay, well, he's the King of Cups, and he signifies full development of one's emotional skills, which can be interpreted as a grace, a composure, while the King of Money would signify discipline, complete mastery in a practical sense. The King of Swords might signify the development of one's intellect, while the King of Wands, or clubs in this case, as this deck calls them, could signify a vision, the development of one's seeing ability on a level deeper than mind and on a more spiritual level. Okay, so we're left with a very thin stack here, and this is the major arcana. So we'll start with the Fool. The Fool signifies a sense of spontaneity and innocence. You can see he's kind of just walking without looking where he's going, and I think one of the decks has him shown almost walking off of a cliff. So it's that kind of innocence and a going with the flow, a carelessness. Next we have the Magician, which signifies a very skilled, person who will not focus apparently, but that's okay. The Magician is a very skilled person, and it can also signify concentration, being able to balance and juggle various things with great skill. Next is the High Priestess, and she is shown with a book on her lap, and she kind of represents knowledge, but knowledge that comes from intuition and from connection with forces that are bigger than oneself, connection with the oneness of everything and higher powers. So she signifies a certain kind of knowing and a certain kind of intuition that comes from that. Next we have the Empress. The Empress is a mother card, often signifying birth or fertility and nurturing, while the Emperor, which is next, is more of a father card. So he tends to signify structure and authority. Next we have the Pope. The Pope is number 5, and the Pope tends to point to the influence of traditions and of conformity in a person's life, while the Lovers are exactly what they sound like. They are a card that represents the union of things, the building or maintaining of bonds, and even just an alignment between people and love. The Chariot. The Chariot is a victory card. Think about Okay, I was going to say Chariots of Fire, but I've actually never seen it, and so I don't actually know if that's relevant at all. But think about a warrior coming back on a chariot, victorious, being celebrated, and specifically it refers to the power of one's will and assertion and the control that one can exercise in order to triumph. Okay. Next we have justice, right? So justice signifies exactly what it sounds like, a fairness, a kind of cause and effect, and the power that cause and effect has over our lives. One could consider it karma, next we have the Hermit. The Hermit has a lamp, and he is a hermit, and he tends to point towards guidance that is found, perhaps new knowledge that's found, but specifically through self-reflection and possibly isolation. Then we have the Wheel of Fortune. And the Wheel of Fortune is a change card. So the change can be in any direction really, but it also points towards the influence of luck and destiny, as it is the Wheel of Fortune. And so something is about to happen, and it's kind of a card that says, who knows what that will be? Which is kind of ironic, as one would look to these cards to find out what that will be. But that card just says, who knows? Next we have Force, and it depicts a woman who is holding open the mouth of a beast of some kind. I think it's a lion. And what Force signifies is courage, bravery, and composure in difficult situations, as she is very composed considering what she's doing right now. And it also signifies a certain element of focus. Okay. Next we have the Hanged Man. The Hanged Man I have seen many interpretations for, including a loss of control and uncertainty, which resonates with me when I just look at the card. But I've also heard it interpreted as sacrifice, martyrdom, so I guess it depends. Next we have Death. It's a very scary looking card and a very scary sounding card, but I don't think it's necessarily a negative. I think it points more towards the influence of cycles, and maybe it's pointing towards the transition into something new. Because in order for one thing to begin, often another thing needs to end, right? So that's all it often means, and it doesn't have to be a doomsday card. Temperance is a card that signifies balance, playing with dualities, exercising moderation in order to balance things, and it can also point towards patience. It's that kind of mood, if you understand what I'm saying. It's like knowing when to quit, kind of a very delicate balance being mastered. Often it can also point towards a decision that needs to be made and the weighing up of pros and cons in order to do so. Then we have the Devil. The Devil has two people chained to him or her, unsure, and what this signifies is contracts and obligations, and it can also signify the consequences of indulging on the material plane, perhaps indulging at the expense of others. The Tower of Destruction is also often viewed as a doomsday card, but what it really means is that there's going to be a sudden change, and maybe this will come with a loss of control, but it can be viewed as a crisis card, and it often is. A crumbling of what you've grown to know. It can mean disaster, but it also might not mean disaster. Then we have the Star. The Star is a card that represents a kind of harmony with whatever is happening, a feeling of renewal and a sense of hope. It's quite a positive card that points towards a positive mindset and attitude. And it can also signify inspiration. And in contrast to that, we have the Moon, which is quite similar to the High Priestess in that it refers to intuition, but the Moon is more about mystery, and it can point towards an illusion, something that you think is true that might not actually be that true at all. And it can even point to secrets being concealed. Then we have the Sun. the Sun is one of the happiest cards, and it kind of signifies a triumph and a resolution over whatever is happening, but also a vitality, a sense of life. And it's a very positive and also a very strong card, and it can also signify an enlightenment. So there are only 2 to go if you're still here. Then we have Judgment. So Judgment refers to a surrender, and the image quite clearly represents that as well. It's a surrender to things greater than yourself, perhaps finally listening to an inner calling that you know to be true. And through surrender, a kind of a rebirth, which I think is beautifully illustrated in this card. I've also, in a more practical sense, heard Judgment be interpreted as going on trial for something that you've done. And finally, we have the World. The World, similarly to the 10s in the Minor Arcana, is kind of like a completion card to the cycle. It's the last card, and it signifies a completion, perhaps even accomplishment, a sense of gratitude, and perhaps even oneness. And it's also a very positive card. There's a sense of unity in the illustration as well, which I quite appreciate, and the closed circle gives you a feel of how this card closes the Minor Arcana. The Major Arcana. Okay. So that is a quick tutorial, maybe not so quick, through the various tarot cards, and I really hope that it taught you something, or that you were at least able to relax, and good luck. Good night.